The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old marketing executive from Chicago, clutching his phone and grinning with the kind of mischief that spelled trouble. It was April 1st, and Marcus had what he thought was the perfect April Fool's prank planned. Marcus had arrived in London 3 days earlier for his first European vacation. He'd saved for 2 years to afford this trip, working overtime and skipping weekend outings with friends. London had always fascinated him, especially the royal traditions and the stoic guards in their iconic red tunics and tall bearskin hats. He'd spent hours watching YouTube videos of tourists trying unsuccessfully to make the guards break character, laughing at their failed attempts. The idea had come to him the night before while scrolling through social media in his cramped hotel room near King's Cross Station. He'd seen dozens of April Fool's pranks going viral, and something clicked. Why not try something that had never been done before? Something that would get millions of views and make him internet famous? He'd carefully researched the guards' protocols, their training, and their legendary discipline. What he planned would either be hilarious or get him arrested, but the potential for viral fame seemed worth the risk. Standing at 5 feet 9 inches with sandy brown hair and an easy smile, Marcus looked like any other tourist. He wore jeans, sneakers, and a navy blue jacket over a white t-shirt. His backpack contained the usual tourist essentials: water bottle, camera, guidebook, and the special items he'd purchased from a costume shop in Covent Garden the previous evening. The shop owner, an elderly man with twinkling eyes, had asked no questions when Marcus bought the realistic-looking royal regalia, including a convincing replica of a ceremonial sword and an official-looking document he'd had printed at an internet cafe. The crowd around him was typical for a Tuesday morning in April. Japanese tourists snapped photos, a family from Germany argued quietly about the best viewing spot, and several British schoolchildren on a field trip chattered excitedly about seeing the Queen's guards. Marcus positioned himself near the front, close to where the guards would march past. His heart raced with anticipation and nerves. At exactly 11 o'clock, the sound of military drums echoed across the courtyard. The crowd fell silent as the old guard emerged from the palace, their movements precise and synchronized. Leading them was Guard Captain James Whitmore, a 34-year-old career soldier from Yorkshire with 15 years of military service. At 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders and steel gray eyes, Captain Whitmore commanded respect wherever he went. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. Captain Whitmore had joined the British Army straight from school, driven by a family tradition of military service that stretched back 4 generations. His great-grandfather had served in World War I, his grandfather in World War II, and his father had been a decorated sergeant in the Falklands War. For James, serving as a Queen's Guard wasn't just a job. It was a sacred duty that connected him to centuries of British history and tradition. The guards marched with mechanical precision, their faces expressionless beneath their imposing bearskin hats. Each step was calculated, each movement part of a choreography perfected over centuries. The sound of their boots on the cobblestones created a rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to make the very air vibrate with authority and tradition. As the formation approached Marcus's position, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. The security personnel, dressed in dark suits and earpieces, were scattered throughout the crowd but seemed relaxed, used to tourists who occasionally stepped out of line for a better photo. What they weren't prepared for was what Marcus was about to do. With surprising confidence, Marcus pulled out his fake document and held it high above his head. In a loud, clear voice that carried across the courtyard, he shouted, "Stop! By order of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, I have urgent royal business with the captain of the guard." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entire formation halted as if struck by lightning. Captain Whitmore's eyes snapped toward Marcus, his expression shifting from ceremonial stoicism to alert attention. The crowd around them fell silent, hundreds of cameras and phones turning toward the unexpected interruption. Security personnel began moving through the crowd, but they hesitated, unsure whether this might be some kind of legitimate royal business they weren't aware of. Marcus pressed his advantage, pulling out his fake sword and holding it ceremonially. "I carry a message from the palace private secretary regarding urgent matters of state," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had clearly rehearsed this moment. He'd watched enough British dramas to nail the accent and formal language. Captain Whitmore stood perfectly still, his mind racing through protocols and procedures. In 15 years of service, he'd never encountered anything like this. Royal messengers were real, though extremely rare, and they did carry authority to interrupt official ceremonies in cases of genuine emergency. The man before him looked like a tourist, but stranger things had happened in royal protocol. The document he held looked official from a distance, and his bearing suggested he knew what he was doing. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The crowd held its breath, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Marcus maintained his authoritative pose, fighting to keep his expression serious while his heart hammered against his ribs. This was the crucial moment where his prank would either work spectacularly or fail catastrophically. Captain Whitmore made his decision. Following protocol for unexpected royal business, he stepped forward and approached Marcus, his movements still formal, but now focused entirely on this potential messenger. "State your business," he said in a low, authoritative voice that somehow carried to every corner of the silent courtyard. Marcus had prepared for this moment, but standing face to face with the imposing Captain Whitmore was more intimidating than he'd expected. The captain's gray eyes seemed to look right through him, and Marcus realized that this man was a trained soldier who had likely seen combat, not just a ceremonial figure. Still, he'd come too far to back down now. "Captain," Marcus began, unfolding his fake document with ceremonial flourish. "Her Majesty requires immediate consultation regarding the royal Easter egg hunt arrangements." He'd chosen this deliberately silly topic, thinking it would make the eventual reveal funnier. But saying it out loud to this serious soldier suddenly made it sound ridiculous even to his own ears. Captain Whitmore's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Years of military training had taught him to assess situations quickly and accurately. Every detail about this supposed messenger was wrong. The document looked like a cheap reproduction, the man's accent was clearly fake, and no royal business would be conducted this way, especially not about Easter egg hunts. But there was something else that bothered Captain Whitmore more than the obvious deception. This man was making a mockery of traditions that were sacred to him, traditions that his family had served for generations, traditions that represented the very heart of British heritage and honor. The uniform he wore, the ceremony he was conducting, the queen he served, none of it was a joke to be laughed at for internet entertainment. The security team was closing in now, having realized that this was not legitimate royal business. But Captain Whitmore held up a hand to stop them. This was his responsibility, his ceremony, his honor being challenged. He would handle this personally. "I see," Captain Whitmore said slowly, his voice carrying a new edge that made Marcus's confidence begin to crumble. "And you are?" Marcus had prepared a fake name and title, but something in the captain's tone warned him that whatever happened next was not going to go according to his plan. The crowd seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, phones still recording, but the initial excitement replaced by growing tension. "Sir Marcus Pemberton," Marcus replied, the fake name sounding hollow even as he spoke it. Royal Messenger. Third class." He'd made up the title on the spot, and it sounded as ridiculous as he feared it would. Captain Whitmore stepped closer, close enough that only Marcus could hear his next words. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, using Marcus's real name. "You have just committed several serious offenses under British law. Impersonating a royal official, disrupting a state ceremony, and creating a public disturbance are just the beginning." Marcus's blood ran cold. How did the captain know his real name? The fake confidence drained from his face as he realized that this situation had spiraled far beyond his control. This wasn't going to be a funny video to share with friends. This was becoming a genuine legal nightmare. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus began weakly, but Captain Whitmore cut him off with a slight shake of his head. "There's been no misunderstanding," the captain replied, his voice still low but carrying absolute authority. "You thought this would be amusing. You thought our traditions, our service, our honor was something to be mocked for entertainment. You were wrong." The crowd had begun to murmur as they sensed something significant was happening, though they couldn't hear the quiet conversation between the two men. Security personnel surrounded them now, but they waited for Captain Whitmore's signal. This was his show, and everyone present understood that. Marcus looked around desperately, hoping to see some avenue of escape or explanation that might salvage the situation. But he was surrounded by professional security in one of the most monitored places in London, having just committed multiple offenses against the crown. His April Fool's prank had become the worst mistake of his life. What happens now? Marcus asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Whitmore studied him for a long moment, his gray eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his words would set in motion a chain of events that would change Marcus's life forever and create a story that would be remembered long after April Fool's Day was forgotten. Now, Mr. Thompson, Captain Whitmore said, you learn what it truly means to respect the crown. The silence that followed Captain Whitmore's words seemed to stretch across the entire courtyard like a heavy blanket. Marcus Thompson stood frozen, still clutching his fake royal document, as the reality of his situation crashed over him like a cold wave. Around them, hundreds of tourists continued filming, unaware that they were capturing what would become one of the most extraordinary encounters in the history of royal protocol. Captain Whitmore raised his hand, and, with military precision, the entire guard formation snapped to attention. The sound of their synchronized movement echoed off the palace walls like a gunshot, causing several tourists to jump. But the captain's attention remained fixed on Marcus, his steel-gray eyes studying the young American who had dared to mock centuries of British tradition. Sergeant Williams, Captain Whitmore called without taking his eyes off Marcus. A tall, lean soldier with sharp features stepped forward from the formation. Sergeant Michael Williams had served under Captain Whitmore for 3 years and had never seen his commanding officer handle a situation quite like this. Take charge of the formation. Continue the ceremony as planned. Yes, sir. Sergeant Williams replied crisply, saluting before turning to address the guards. The formation moved with mechanical precision, resuming their march as if nothing had happened. But every guard in the unit understood that something significant was taking place, something that would be talked about in their barracks for years to come. Marcus watched the guards continue their ceremony, feeling increasingly isolated as Captain Whitmore remained motionless beside him. The security personnel had formed a discreet circle around them, but they made no move to arrest him. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for something, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd while maintaining communication through their earpieces. Captain, Marcus began hesitantly, his voice cracking slightly. I think maybe we should just, you think? Captain Whitmore interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Marcus fall silent immediately. You think you can waltz into one of Britain's most sacred ceremonies, mock traditions that date back centuries, disrespect the service of thousands of brave men and women, and then simply walk away because it was a joke? The crowd around them had begun to realize that this wasn't part of the regular ceremony. Phones and cameras remained focused on the two men, but the cheerful chatter had been replaced by an anxious murmur. Parents pulled their children closer, and several tourists began backing away, sensing that the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Captain Whitmore noticed a young British boy, perhaps 10 years old, watching the scene with wide eyes. The boy wore a school uniform and held a small Union Jack flag, clearly on a field trip to see the guard ceremony. The captain's expression softened slightly as he looked at the child, remembering his own first visit to see the guards when he was that age. His grandfather had brought him, explaining the importance of duty, honor, and service to the crown. It was that visit that had planted the seed of his military career. Do you see that boy? Captain Whitmore asked Marcus quietly, nodding toward the child. He came here today to witness something special, something that connects him to his history and heritage. What do you think he'll remember about this day? Your clever prank, or the lesson about respecting the institutions that have protected his country for generations? Marcus followed the captain's gaze to the boy and felt a wave of shame wash over him. He'd been so focused on creating content for social media that he'd never considered how his actions might affect others, especially children who looked up to these ceremonies with genuine wonder and respect. I didn't think about that, Marcus admitted, his voice barely audible. No, you didn't think, Captain Whitmore replied. But that doesn't absolve you of responsibility. Actions have consequences, Mr. Thompson, especially when those actions mock something that people have died to protect. The captain's words hit Marcus harder than any arrest or fine could have. For the first time since arriving in London, he began to understand that what he'd seen as harmless fun was actually an attack on something deeply meaningful to millions of people. The guards weren't just tourist attractions. They were symbols of continuity, honor, and sacrifice that stretched back through centuries of British history. What can I do to make this right? Marcus asked, surprised by his own sincerity. Something about Captain Whitmore's quiet authority and genuine passion for his duty had awakened a sense of responsibility that Marcus hadn't felt in years. Captain Whitmore studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Around them, the changing of the guard ceremony continued with flawless precision, but the captain's attention remained focused on this unexpected teachable moment. In his years of service, he dealt with countless tourists who showed disrespect through ignorance or carelessness, but this was different. This young man had planned his disruption, invested time and money in making it convincing, all for the sake of entertainment at the expense of something sacred. "Come with me," Captain Whitmore said finally, turning toward the palace. The security personnel parted to create a path, but they remained close, ready to intervene if necessary. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure whether this was leading to his arrest or something else entirely, but he followed the captain toward the imposing gates of Buckingham Palace. As they walked, Captain Whitmore began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of years of service and deep knowledge of military history. "The Queen's Guard isn't just a ceremonial position, Mr. Thompson. Every man in that formation is a trained soldier who has sworn an oath to protect the crown and the people of Britain. Many have served in combat zones, risking their lives for their country. The uniform, the ceremony, the traditions you mocked represent their sacrifice and dedication." They passed through a side entrance that Marcus would never have imagined tourists could access. The security was subtle but overwhelming. Cameras tracked their movement. Guards at every checkpoint recognized Captain Whitmore with respectful nods, and Marcus began to understand just how significant his guide was within this world of royal protocol and military precision. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked, his voice echoing slightly in the ornate corridors lined with portraits of former monarchs and military heroes. "To understand what you've disrespected," Captain Whitmore replied. "You wanted to be part of royal tradition, didn't you? Even if it was through mockery? Well, now you're going to learn what that tradition actually means." They stopped before a heavy wooden door marked "Private, Authorized Personnel Only." Captain Whitmore produced a key card and opened the door, revealing a room that took Marcus's breath away. The walls were covered with regimental colors, battle honors, and photographs spanning decades of royal ceremonies. Display cases contained medals, weapons, and uniforms from different eras, each item telling a story of service and sacrifice. "This is the Queen's Guard Museum," Captain Whitmore explained, his voice taking on a reverent tone. "Not open to the public. Every item here represents a life dedicated to service, often at the cost of everything else." Marcus moved slowly through the room, his eyes wide as he took in the displays. One case contained a Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor, alongside a photograph of a young soldier who looked barely older than Marcus himself. The accompanying plaque described how the soldier had died saving his comrades during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, posthumously awarded the medal for his extraordinary courage. Another display showed uniforms and equipment from the Falklands War, including personal items from soldiers who had served with distinction in that conflict. Marcus paused at a photograph of a group of guards before their deployment, young faces full of determination and pride. A small plaque noted that 3 of the men in the photograph had not returned home. "My father is in this photograph," Captain Whitmore said quietly, pointing to a young soldier in the back row. "He was 22 when this was taken, about to deploy to the South Atlantic. He came back, but not unchanged. The things he saw, the friends he lost, the responsibilities he carried, they shaped everything about how he raised me to understand duty and honor." Marcus found himself deeply moved by the personal connection. This wasn't just history to Captain Whitmore. It was family legacy, personal sacrifice, and living tradition. Every joke about the Guard's stoic expressions or rigid discipline took on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of genuine military service and real human cost. "I'm beginning to understand," Marcus said softly, studying another display that showed letters from soldiers to their families, written before major battles with uncertain outcomes. The handwriting was careful and heartfelt, full of love and hope despite the shadow of possible death. "Are you?" Captain Whitmore asked, his tone suggesting this was a genuine question rather than rhetorical challenge. "Because understanding is just the first step. The question is what you intend to do with that understanding." They continued through the museum, and Marcus learned about the history of the Queen's Guard, the training required to earn the position, and the ongoing military service that most guards performed alongside their ceremonial duties. Many had served multiple tours in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflict zones, bringing real combat experience to their protective role around the royal family. Captain Whitmore showed Marcus photographs from recent deployments, where men who normally wore red tunics and bearskin hats had instead worn combat fatigues in desert and mountain environments. The contrast was striking, but the common thread was clear. These were serious soldiers who took their responsibilities seriously, whether ceremonial or combat. Every time someone mocks what we do, Captain Whitmore explained, they're not just making fun of pageantry. They're diminishing the sacrifice of everyone who has served in this capacity, everyone who has put duty before personal comfort, everyone who has faced genuine danger in service to something larger than themselves. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. His April Fool's prank had seemed so innocent when he planned it, just another viral video in an endless stream of internet content. But, standing in this room, surrounded by the evidence of real service and sacrifice, he understood that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond entertainment value. What happens now? Marcus asked, echoing his earlier question, but with a completely different understanding of its implications. Captain Whitmore studied him carefully, as if making a decision that would affect both their futures. When he finally spoke, his words would set in motion an extraordinary sequence of events that would transform Marcus's understanding of service, responsibility, and the true meaning of honor. Now, Mr. Thompson, Captain Whitmore said, you have a choice to make. You can leave here having learned something important about respect and responsibility, or you can do something more meaningful with this experience. The weight of Captain Whitmore's words settled over Marcus like a challenge he couldn't ignore. Standing in the private museum surrounded by centuries of military history and sacrifice, he felt something shifting inside himself that he didn't fully understand. The man who had entered Buckingham Palace as a prankster seeking viral fame was beginning to transform into someone who understood the deeper meaning of service and respect. What kind of choice? Marcus asked, his voice uncertain but genuinely curious. He'd expected to be arrested, fined, or simply escorted out of the country. Instead, he found himself being offered something that sounded like an opportunity rather than a punishment. Captain Whitmore moved to a window that overlooked the palace courtyard, where tourists continued to gather and take photos, unaware of the extraordinary conversation taking place above them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds, and, in the distance, they could hear the sounds of London traffic, a reminder of the world beyond these historic walls. In my 15 years of service, Captain Whitmore began, I've encountered thousands of tourists, protesters, and people who think they understand what we do. Most are simply ignorant, going through life without ever considering the sacrifice that makes their freedom possible. Some are hostile, viewing tradition as outdated or oppressive. But, occasionally, very rarely, I meet someone who has the capacity to truly understand and perhaps even help others understand. He turned back to Marcus, his gray eyes serious but no longer cold. Your stunt this morning was witnessed by hundreds of people and filmed by dozens more. By now, those videos are probably spreading across social media, showing a disruption of one of Britain's most sacred ceremonies. What message do you think those videos convey? Marcus felt his stomach sink as he considered the implications. In his excitement to create viral content, he'd never thought about how his prank might be interpreted by others who watched it online. Would they see it as harmless fun, or would it encourage more serious disruptions? Would it diminish respect for the guards and their service? I think I've made a terrible mistake, Marcus admitted, the full weight of his actions finally hitting him. People watching those videos might think it's okay to disrupt these ceremonies. Or worse, they might lose respect for what the guards represent. Exactly, Captain Whitmore nodded. But awareness of a mistake is the beginning of wisdom. The question now is whether you're willing to help correct the damage you've done. Marcus looked around the museum again, taking in the faces of the young soldiers in the photographs, the medals earned through extraordinary courage, the letters written by men facing possible death in service to their country. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly ashamed of his actions, but also inspired by the examples of service and sacrifice surrounding him. Tell me what I can do, Marcus said firmly. I want to make this right. Captain Whitmore studied him for a long moment, as if confirming that this transformation was genuine rather than merely expedient. Then, he moved to a desk in the corner of the room and pulled out a folder containing official documents and photographs. The Queen's Guard has been looking for someone to help us with a special project, he began. We've been concerned about the growing trend of tourists disrupting our ceremonies for social media content. What we need is someone who understands that world, someone who can speak to people who might be tempted to do what you did today, and help them understand why they shouldn't. Marcus's eyes widened as he began to understand what Captain Whitmore was suggesting. You want me to help prevent other people from making the same mistake I made? More than that, Captain Whitmore replied. We want you to help people understand what these traditions really mean, why they matter, and how they connect to something larger than themselves. You have something most of our public relations people don't have. You've been on both sides of this situation. You know what it's like to see us as just a tourist attraction, and now you're beginning to understand what we actually represent. The offer was extraordinary and completely unexpected. Marcus had come to London as a tourist looking for entertainment, and now he was being invited to become an ambassador for one of Britain's most revered institutions. The responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the opportunity to transform his mistake into something meaningful. What would this involve? Marcus asked, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. Captain Whitmore opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk. The Ministry of Defense has been developing a new outreach program to educate the public about military service and the importance of respecting ceremonial duties. We need someone who can connect with young people, especially Americans and other international visitors, who might not understand the significance of what they're witnessing. The documents outlined a comprehensive program that would involve creating educational content, speaking at schools and universities, and working with social media platforms to promote respect for military traditions. It was a real job with real responsibilities, not just a public relations gesture. This would mean staying in London? Marcus asked, his mind racing with possibilities and complications. He had a job back in Chicago, an apartment lease, and a life that suddenly seemed small and meaningless compared to what was being offered. Initially, yes, Captain Whitmore confirmed. The program requires someone who can work closely with our team, understand our protocols and traditions from the inside, and develop authentic content that resonates with people who might otherwise view us as merely decorative. Marcus thought about his marketing job in Chicago, creating advertisements for products that people didn't really need, manipulating emotions to drive sales of items that would be forgotten within months. The contrast with what Captain Whitmore was offering couldn't have been starker. This was a chance to do work that actually mattered, to help preserve something valuable and meaningful for future generations. There's something else, Captain Whitmore continued, his tone becoming more serious. This program comes with responsibilities and requirements that go far beyond typical employment. You would be representing the Crown, the military, and centuries of British tradition. The standards of conduct and personal behavior are extremely high, and failure to meet them would result in immediate dismissal and possible legal consequences. The warning was clear, but rather than deterring Marcus, it made the opportunity seem even more significant. For the first time in his life, he was being offered a chance to be part of something that demanded the best of him, something that required genuine commitment and sacrifice rather than just showing up and collecting a paycheck. I understand, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision he was contemplating. But I need to ask you something. Why are you offering this to me? I mean, I just disrupted your ceremony and made a mockery of something you hold sacred. Why not just have me arrested and find someone else for this program? Captain Whitmore smiled slightly, the first time Marcus had seen any warmth in his expression since their encounter began. Because, Mr. Thompson, sometimes the best advocates for something are people who have genuinely learned to appreciate its value rather than those who have never questioned it. You understand what it's like to not take this seriously, which means you might be uniquely qualified to help others make that transition. The logic was compelling, but Marcus sensed there was more to it than that. And because in my experience, the people who make the biggest mistakes often have the greatest capacity for growth and service, provided they're willing to accept responsibility and work to make amends, Captain Whitmore continued. Your prank showed creativity, planning, and confidence. Those are valuable qualities when applied to constructive purposes. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward this man who had every reason to be angry with him, but instead was offering him a chance at redemption and purpose. The transformation from tourist prankster to guardian of tradition seemed impossible, but standing in this room surrounded by examples of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things, it began to seem not just possible, but necessary. If I accept this offer, Marcus said carefully, what happens to the videos from this morning? People filmed everything, and by now those videos are probably all over the internet. Captain Whitmore nodded, having anticipated this concern. That's actually part of why this opportunity exists. Those videos will continue to circulate, but Their impact depends entirely on what story gets told about what happened next. If the narrative ends with a successful prank that embarrassed the guards, it encourages more of the same behavior. But if the story continues with education, understanding, and positive change, it becomes something entirely different. The strategic thinking behind the offer became clear to Marcus. This wasn't just about him, or even about preventing future disruptions. This was about transforming a potential public relations disaster into an educational opportunity that could reach millions of people through the same social media channels that had originally spread his prank. You want me to become part of the story, Marcus realized. To show people that there's a better way to engage with these traditions than through mockery or disruption. Exactly, Captain Whitmore confirmed. But only if your transformation is genuine. This program has no room for performers or people seeking personal fame. It requires someone who truly understands and respects what we do, someone who can authentically communicate that respect to others. Marcus looked around the museum one final time, taking in the photographs of young soldiers, the battle honors earned through courage and sacrifice, and the centuries of tradition that connected all of it to the present moment. When he turned back to Captain Whitmore, his decision was clear. I accept, Marcus said firmly. I want to help people understand what I've learned today. I want to turn my mistake into something meaningful. Captain Whitmore extended his hand, and when Marcus shook it, he felt as if he was not just accepting a job, but embarking on a completely different life. The handshake was firm and brief, but it carried the weight of commitment and the promise of transformation. Welcome to the service of the Crown, Mr. Thompson, Captain Whitmore said formally. Your real education begins now. The following morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to match Marcus Thompson's nervous energy as he stood outside the Wellington barracks at precisely 0700 hours. He wore his best business attire, a navy suit that suddenly felt inadequate compared to the crisp uniforms of the soldiers moving purposefully around the military facility. His transformation from tourist prankster to royal protocol educator was about to begin in earnest. Captain Whitmore emerged from the main building, his bearing as commanding as ever despite the early hour. Behind him walked a woman Marcus hadn't met before, Major Sarah Hendricks, the Ministry of Defense's Director of Public Engagement. She was in her mid-40s, with short auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to assess Marcus completely within the first few seconds of their meeting. Mr. Thompson, Major Hendricks said briskly, extending her hand. I've read the reports of yesterday's incident and Captain Whitmore's recommendation. What you're proposing to undertake is unprecedented in our history, and, frankly, many of my colleagues think it's a terrible idea. Marcus felt his confidence waver slightly. And what do you think, Major? I think that traditional approaches to public education haven't been working, she replied honestly. Tourist disruptions are increasing, social media pranks targeting our ceremonies are becoming more elaborate, and public understanding of military service is declining. We need new approaches, and sometimes the most effective advocates are converts rather than lifelong believers. They walked through the barracks, past training facilities, and administrative buildings that hummed with military efficiency. Marcus noticed how every soldier they encountered acknowledged Captain Whitmore and Major Hendricks with precise salutes and respectful greetings. The level of discipline and mutual respect was unlike anything he'd experienced in his civilian career. Your first challenge, Major Hendricks continued as they entered a conference room, will be understanding the full scope of what you've committed to represent. The Queen's Guard isn't just ceremonial pageantry. These soldiers serve in combat zones, protect the royal family from genuine threats, and maintain readiness for military action at all times. Your education program must convey that reality while still appealing to people who initially see only the tourist spectacle. The conference room walls were covered with charts, photographs, and strategic planning documents related to public engagement and security protocols. Marcus realized that his spontaneous prank had intersected with much larger issues of national security, public relations, and military tradition that extended far beyond his personal situation. Captain Whitmore took a seat across from Marcus and opened a thick folder. Before you can educate others, you need to understand what you're talking about. Over the next 6 weeks, you'll undergo an abbreviated version of our cultural and historical training program. You'll learn about regimental history, ceremonial protocols, and the military significance of traditions that tourists see but don't understand. You'll also, Major Hendricks added, spend time with active duty guards to understand their perspective. Many of these soldiers have served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Their stories aren't part of the public narrative, but they're essential to understanding why this service matters. Marcus nodded, feeling both excited and overwhelmed by the comprehensive nature of his education. This wasn't going to be a quick public relations exercise. It was a genuine immersion in military culture and tradition that would challenge everything he thought he knew about service and sacrifice. The first week was intensive classroom instruction led by military historians and protocol experts. Marcus learned that the traditions he'd mocked had evolved over centuries, each element serving specific purposes related to discipline, unit cohesion, and tactical effectiveness. The famous red tunics weren't just colorful costumes. They had originated as practical military uniforms designed to intimidate enemies and identify friendly forces on confused battlefields. The bearskin hats, which tourists often found amusing, had military origins dating back to the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where British guards had defeated Napoleon's Imperial Guard and adopted their distinctive headgear as a symbol of victory. Every aspect of the ceremony, from the timing of movements to the specific musical selections, connected to military history and tactical principles that had been proven in combat. Marcus found himself genuinely fascinated by the complexity and depth of traditions he had previously seen as simple tourist attractions. Each lesson revealed new layers of meaning and historical significance that transformed his understanding of what he had witnessed at Buckingham Palace. The second week brought him into contact with current serving guards, and this is where his education became truly transformative. Sergeant David Mitchell, a 26-year-old from Newcastle, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. His left hand bore scars from an improvised explosive device that had killed 2 members of his patrol, and his quiet dignity in discussing his experiences left Marcus deeply moved. People see us standing motionless in front of the palace and think it's easy duty, Sergeant Mitchell explained during one of their conversations. They don't understand that we're constantly alert for threats, that we've been trained to respond to everything from pickpockets to terrorist attacks, that we carry the same level of responsibility whether we're in combat fatigues in Helmand Province or ceremonial dress in London. Another guard, Corporal James Patterson, had grown up in foster care in Birmingham and credited the military with giving him purpose and belonging he'd never found elsewhere. His pride in wearing the uniform was evident in every aspect of his bearing, and his dedication to the ceremonial duties reflected a deep understanding of their significance beyond mere tradition. When I put on this uniform, Corporal Patterson told Marcus, I'm not just representing myself or even my regiment. I'm connected to every soldier who has ever worn it, every battle they've fought, every sacrifice they've made. That's not something you mock. It's something you honor with your life, if necessary. These personal conversations had a profound impact on Marcus's understanding of military service. These weren't actors playing roles for tourist entertainment. They were professional soldiers who had risked everything in service to their country and who approached their ceremonial duties with the same seriousness they brought to combat operations. By the third week, Marcus was accompanying guards on their duties, observing from behind the scenes as they prepared for ceremonies and maintained security around royal residences. He watched them practice movements until they achieved mechanical precision, studied their security briefings, and learned about the constant vigilance required to protect the royal family while maintaining the appearance of peaceful ceremony. The physical demands were more challenging than he had expected. The ceremonial uniforms were heavy and uncomfortable. The movements required precise timing and coordination, and the ability to maintain composure while tourists took photos, made jokes, and occasionally attempted disruptions demanded exceptional self-discipline. Major Hendricks visited regularly to assess his progress, and her initial skepticism gradually gave way to cautious optimism as she observed Marcus's genuine transformation. You're beginning to understand, she told him after watching him participate in a practice ceremony. But understanding is different from being able to communicate that understanding to others who haven't had this experience. The real test came in the 4th week when Marcus was asked to create his first educational content. Working with the ministry's media team, he developed a short video that would become the template for the larger education program. The video opened with footage of his original prank, but instead of celebrating the disruption, it used the incident as a starting point for deeper exploration of what the ceremony actually represented. 6 weeks ago, I thought this was just a tourist attraction, Marcus said to the camera, standing in the same courtyard where his prank had taken place. I planned what I thought was a harmless joke, but I didn't understand that I was mocking something sacred to millions of people, something that represents sacrifice, honor, and service that extends back centuries. The video then showed him meeting with active duty guards, learning about their combat service, and discovering the historical significance of traditions he had previously dismissed. It was honest about his initial ignorance while demonstrating genuine respect for what he had learned to value. The guards you see in these ceremonies aren't performers, Marcus continued. They're professional soldiers who have served in combat zones, who risk their lives to protect others, who maintain readiness to defend their country at all times. When we mock their service, we're not just making fun of pageantry. We're diminishing the sacrifice of everyone who has ever served. The video concluded with Marcus speaking directly to potential pranksters. I thought I was being clever, but I was actually being disrespectful to something much larger and more important than my desire for internet fame. Before you plan your own harmless joke, take time to understand what these traditions mean and why they matter to people who have given everything in service to something greater than themselves. The response to the video was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours of its release, it had been viewed over 2 million times across various social media platforms. Comments ranged from appreciation for Marcus's honesty and growth to criticism from those who felt he was being used for propaganda purposes. But the most meaningful feedback came from military families and veterans who expressed gratitude for someone taking the time to understand and communicate the reality of military service. Many shared their own stories of sacrifice and service, creating a conversation about the meaning of honor and tradition that extended far beyond Marcus's original prank. Captain Whitmore found Marcus reviewing the comments and social media response in his temporary office at the barracks. "How does it feel to create content that actually matters?" he asked. Marcus looked up from his laptop, his expression thoughtful. "Different," he admitted. "In my old job, success was measured by clicks and engagement, but those metrics didn't mean the content had any lasting value. This feels like it might actually help people understand something important." "The real test," Captain Whitmore replied, "will be whether it prevents others from making the mistake you made. Education is only valuable if it changes behavior." As if summoned by their conversation, Major Hendricks appeared in the doorway with a tablet in her hand. "We may have our first indication of impact," she announced, entering the room. Security at Buckingham Palace reports that 3 different tourists approached guards today to ask genuine questions about their service rather than attempting disruptions. That's unusual for a weekday. Marcus felt a surge of pride and hope. If his transformation from prankster to educator was inspiring others to approach military traditions with respect rather than mockery, then perhaps his mistake was becoming something genuinely meaningful. "What's next?" Marcus asked, ready to continue the journey that had begun with his foolish April Fool's prank and was evolving into something that might change his entire life's direction. Captain Whitmore and Major Hendricks exchanged a look that suggested they had been planning for this moment. When Major Hendricks spoke, her words would launch Marcus into the most challenging and rewarding phase of his unexpected new career. 6 months after his failed April Fool's prank, Marcus Thompson stood before an audience of 300 university students at Oxford, preparing to deliver what would become one of the most important speeches of his life. The grand lecture hall buzzed with conversation as students filed in, many of them holding phones already recording, expecting to see the American who had become famous for disrupting a royal ceremony and then transforming into an unlikely advocate for military tradition. Major Hendricks sat in the front row, her expression neutral but attentive. Beside her, Captain Whitmore wore civilian clothes for the first time Marcus had ever seen him, but his military bearing remained unmistakable. In the weeks since Marcus's educational video had gone viral, they had become not just his supervisors but his mentors in understanding the deeper meaning of service and responsibility. The past months had been a whirlwind of activity that had changed Marcus's life in ways he could never have imagined when he stepped off the plane at Heathrow with his fake royal credentials and smartphone full of prank ideas. The education program he was helping to develop had expanded beyond simple tourist awareness to become a comprehensive initiative that was being studied by military organizations around the world. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. 6 months ago, I stood outside Buckingham Palace with a fake sword and a ridiculous story about royal Easter egg hunts, thinking I was about to create the funniest video the internet had ever seen. Instead, I was about to learn the most important lesson of my life about respect, responsibility, and what it truly means to serve something greater than yourself. The audience settled into attentive silence, many having seen the original prank video and curious about the story behind his transformation. Marcus had delivered similar presentations at dozens of schools and universities across Britain, but this Oxford audience was particularly significant because it included students from around the world who would return to their home countries carrying whatever message he managed to convey. I want to start with a question, Marcus continued, clicking to his first slide, which showed a photograph of the Queen's Guard in ceremonial formation. When you look at this image, what do you see? Be honest. Don't tell me what you think you should see. Tell me what actually comes to mind when you look at these soldiers. Hands went up around the hall, and Marcus called on students to share their immediate reactions. The responses were varied, but predictable. Tourist attraction, outdated tradition, ceremonial pageantry, photo opportunity. A few students mentioned duty and service, but most focused on the visual spectacle rather than the underlying significance. Those were exactly my thoughts, Marcus acknowledged. I saw costumes instead of uniforms, performance instead of service, entertainment instead of sacrifice. And that perspective led me to make a decision that could have resulted in my arrest and deportation, but instead became the beginning of the most meaningful experience of my life. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a split image, his original prank video on one side, and a recent photograph of him working with active duty guards on the other. The contrast was striking, not just in his appearance and bearing, but in the entire context of his relationship with the military tradition he had once mocked. The difference between these two images isn't just about my personal growth, Marcus explained. It's about the difference between seeing the surface of something and understanding its depth, between consuming culture for entertainment and respecting culture for its meaning and significance. He spent the next 20 minutes walking the audience through his education process, sharing stories from the guards he had met and learned from. He talked about Sergeant Mitchell's scars from Afghanistan, about Corporal Patterson's journey from foster care to military service, about Captain Whitmore's family legacy of sacrifice and dedication to duty. These aren't actors, Marcus emphasized, his voice carrying passion that had developed through months of genuine learning and respect. They're professional soldiers who have risked their lives in combat, who maintain readiness to defend their country at any moment, who approach their ceremonial duties with the same seriousness they bring to military operations in war zones. A student raised her hand during the question period that followed. But isn't this just military propaganda? I mean, you were facing legal consequences, so of course you're going to say what they want you to say. It was a fair question, and one that Marcus had anticipated and struggled with himself. His answer came from months of genuine reflection and experience rather than from any script or coaching. That's a legitimate concern, he replied honestly. And I asked myself the same question many times during this process. But here's the thing. No one forced me to continue with this program after my legal situation was resolved. I could have left Britain weeks ago and returned to my old life in Chicago. I stayed because what I learned here changed my understanding of service, sacrifice, and responsibility in ways that made my previous life feel shallow and meaningless. He paused to let that statement sink in before continuing. I'm not here to recruit anyone for military service or to convince you that all traditions should be accepted without question. I'm here to suggest that before we mock or dismiss something, we should take the time to understand what it actually represents and why it matters to the people who participate in it. Another student, this one clearly skeptical, asked, but don't you think some traditions deserve to be mocked if they represent outdated power structures or militaristic values that we should be moving away from? Marcus nodded, appreciating the thoughtful nature of the question. Absolutely, some traditions should be examined critically and potentially changed or abandoned. But criticism based on understanding is different from mockery based on ignorance. When I disrupted that ceremony, I hadn't taken any time to learn about what it represented or why it mattered to people. I was criticizing something I didn't understand, which isn't constructive criticism, it's just destructive noise. The conversation continued for over an hour, ranging across topics of military service, cultural respect, personal responsibility, and the role of social media in shaping public discourse. Marcus found himself drawing on months of study and reflection to address complex questions about tradition, change, and the balance between honoring the past and building the future. After the formal presentation ended, many students approached Marcus individually to continue the conversation. One young woman from Germany shared that her grandfather had served in the military, and that Marcus's presentation had helped her understand his pride in that service. A British student mentioned that he had been considering a gap year before university and was now thinking about military service as a way to gain perspective and contribute to something meaningful. Captain Whitmore approached as the last students were leaving. "How did it feel?" he asked. "Different from anything I've ever done," Marcus replied honestly. "In my old career, success was measured by clicks and views and sales conversions. But this feels like it might actually matter in people's lives." Major Hendricks joined them, carrying a tablet with preliminary feedback from the evening's presentation. "Early social media response is overwhelmingly positive," she reported. "More importantly, we're seeing engagement from young people who are asking genuine questions about military service rather than just sharing memes or prank videos." The three of them walked out of Oxford together, and Marcus reflected on how surreal his life had become. 6 months ago, he had been a marketing executive whose biggest concern was whether his latest campaign would increase quarterly sales figures. Now he was working to help young people understand concepts like honor, duty, and sacrifice that he was still learning to fully appreciate himself. "What's next for the program?" Marcus asked as they reached the train station. "Expansion," Major Hendricks replied. "We've received requests from military organizations in 12 different countries who want to adapt this educational approach for their own traditions and ceremonies. Your transformation from prankster to educator has become a case study in how to turn negative incidents into positive educational opportunities," Captain Whitmore added. "More importantly, we're seeing measurable changes in behavior. Tourist disruptions at ceremonial events are down significantly, and we're receiving more genuine inquiries about military service from young people who have been influenced by this educational campaign." As they waited for their train back to London, Marcus thought about the phone call he had received from his former employer in Chicago the previous week. They had offered him a substantial salary increase and promotion to return to his marketing position, arguing that his newfound fame would make him valuable for their social media campaigns. He had declined without hesitation, realizing that his life had developed meaning and purpose that couldn't be measured in salary figures or job titles. The work he was doing now felt essential in a way that his previous career never had, connecting him to something larger than personal success or financial gain. "I want to ask you both something," Marcus said as their train approached. "When you first offered me this opportunity, did you think it would work? Did you believe that someone like me could actually become an effective advocate for military tradition?" Major Hendricks smiled, the first completely relaxed expression Marcus had seen from her. "Honestly, I thought it was a terrible idea that would probably result in embarrassment for everyone involved. But James convinced me that sometimes the most effective teachers are people who have genuinely learned something important rather than those who have always known it." Captain Whitmore nodded. "I saw something in you that day at Buckingham Palace, something beyond the foolish prank. You had energy, creativity, and confidence. Those qualities can be destructive when applied thoughtlessly, but they can be powerful forces for good when directed toward meaningful purposes." As the train carried them back toward London, Marcus watched the British countryside pass by in the gathering darkness. He thought about the young soldiers he had met, the stories of sacrifice he had learned, and the responsibility he now carried to help others understand what he had discovered about service and honor. His phone buzzed with notifications from social media, responses to clips from his Oxford presentation that were already being shared around the world. But, unlike his previous life, when such attention had been an end in itself, he now saw it as a tool for something more important, helping people understand that some things in life are sacred, that service to others can give meaning to existence, and that respect for tradition doesn't require abandoning progress, but rather understanding what is worth preserving as society evolves. The train pulled into London as Marcus realized that his failed April Fool's prank had become the beginning of a life he could never have imagined, but wouldn't trade for anything. He had set out to entertain strangers on the internet, and instead had discovered a purpose that connected him to centuries of human service and sacrifice. It was, he thought with deep gratitude, the most spectacular failure of his life, and the greatest success he could ever hope to achieve.